Football has always admired movement. Midfielders run, they press, they recover. They cover distances that stretch across the entire pitch. As the game became faster and more demanding, control increasingly belonged to those who could sustain its intensity. Managers wanted players who could arrive first, react quicker, and impose themselves physically on every phase of play. But hidden inside that evolution is a strange contradiction. Because for nearly 2 decades, one midfielder controlled matches while appearing to do less than everyone around him. He rarely sprinted, he seldom chased opponents. Sometimes he even looked detached from the urgency surrounding him. Yet teams pressed when he wanted them to press, slowed down when he wanted them to slow down, and spent entire evenings following decisions they never seemed able to predict. It wasn't because he ignored movement, it was because he understood something more valuable than distance: time. And while football was becoming obsessed with how quickly players could reach the next moment, Andrea Pirlo had already learned how to decide when that moment would arrive. Andrea Pirlo did not grow up looking like the midfielder modern football was preparing itself to admire. At youth level, he was viewed as a gifted attacking player, a traditional number 10 whose value came from technique, vision, and an unusual calmness on the ball. Born in the small town of Flero near Brescia, Pirlo developed in an environment where creativity was still encouraged, where midfielders were expected to invent rather than organize. But by the late 1990s, football was beginning to change. The game was becoming more athletic, transitions were becoming faster, and spaces for classic playmakers were disappearing. Pirlo seemed to belong to a generation that was slowly losing its place. His rise into senior football reflected that uncertainty. At Brescia, flashes of his talent were obvious, but his move to Inter brought more questions than answers. Coaches saw his passing ability, yet struggled to understand where he truly belonged. He lacked the explosive acceleration expected from an attacking midfielder. He didn't possess the defensive intensity associated with deeper players. In a sport increasingly obsessed with specialization, Pirlo appeared strangely undefined. He wasn't failing because he lacked quality. He was struggling because football had not yet discovered the position that could fully accommodate his qualities. The irony is that what made Pirlo seem incomplete was precisely what made him unique. He didn't experience matches through speed, he experienced them through rhythm. While opponents focused on winning duels and covering ground, Pirlo seemed preoccupied with something else entirely: the sequence of decisions that would eventually shape the game. He wasn't interested in arriving first. He wanted to decide when others should begin moving at all. But at the time, that understanding looked less like intelligence and more like limitation. And so, as football accelerated into a new era, Pirlo found himself caught between two worlds: too elegant for the physical demands emerging around him, too passive for managers seeking constant intensity, too unconventional for a game becoming increasingly structured. It seemed possible that one of Italy's most technically gifted midfielders would spend his career searching for a role that no longer existed, until someone stopped asking what Andrea Pirlo couldn't do and started asking what football could become if everything revolved around what he could. At first glance, moving Andrea Pirlo deeper into midfield looked like a compromise. Attacking midfielders are usually pushed backward when they lose something: pace, mobility, the ability to influence matches close to goal. It often feels less like an evolution and more like an admission that the player can no longer survive where football is heading. So when Pirlo arrived at AC Milan and was repositioned by Carlo Ancelotti in front of the defense, there was little reason to believe it would become one of the defining tactical decisions of the modern era. But Pirlo wasn't moved away from danger. He was moved closer to information. From deep midfield, the entire pitch unfolded in front of him. Pressing patterns became visible. Defensive lines revealed their intentions earlier. Teammates were no longer options appearing at the edge of his vision. They became pieces moving inside a larger picture he could observe in full. Most midfielders use movement to create passing lanes. Pirlo used patience. He would receive possession, wait half a second longer than expected, invite pressure toward him, and then release the ball into the space the pressure itself had just created. The less he moved, the more everyone else seemed to. This is where the title begins to make sense. Pirlo did not control football without running because he lacked energy. He controlled football without running because running was often the solution to problems he had already solved mentally. Opponents pressed harder, only to discover that their movement had become part of his design. Midfielders chased shadows because the ball had already left before they fully committed. Defenders stepped forward, anticipating a pass that never came. He wasn't escaping pressure through athleticism. He was making pressure arrive too late to matter. And gradually, football stopped seeing him as a playmaker who had been moved backwards. It started seeing him as something much more unusual, a player who understood that the fastest way to move the game forward is not always through speed. Sometimes it is through waiting. And years later, against England on how powerful that understanding could become. The quarterfinal between Italy and England at the 2012 European Championship should have exposed Andrea Pirlo's limitations. England were younger, more athletic, and prepared to disrupt Italy's rhythm through pressure and compactness. On paper, this was exactly the type of match modern football says a midfielder like Pirlo should struggle in. A game played at high intensity, filled with transitions where mobility often matters more than elegance. Instead, it became evidence for a completely different idea. Pirlo finished the match with 131 completed passes, more than the entire England midfield combined. But numbers alone do not explain what happened. The deeper truth was that England spent almost 2 hours reacting to decisions they could never quite anticipate. Pirlo would drift into spaces that seemed harmless, receive possession without urgency, and pause. Not because he lacked options, but because he was studying reactions. Midfielders stepped toward him. Wingers narrowed their positions, defensive lines adjusted, and only when everyone had committed to their movement would he release the ball elsewhere. He wasn't outrunning England's midfield. He was making them run according to his schedule. This is what separated Pirlo from other playmakers. Most creators manipulate space. Pirlo manipulated time. Every touch seemed to alter the speed of the match itself. When England wanted chaos, he introduced order. When they tried to accelerate the game, he slowed it down until frustration began to appear in their body language. Players who should have been dictating pressure started hesitating, unsure whether stepping forward would actually win possession or simply create another passing lane. Football often rewards those who react quickest. Pirlo forced opponents into a state where reacting quickly only meant arriving late. And perhaps the most fitting image of that night arrived after the match at someone else to move when he wanted them to. Andrea Pirlo's success created a subtle challenge for the teams built around him. The more influential he became, the more everyone else had to compensate for what he deliberately refused to do. Football had already begun moving toward intensity, pressing, and physical dominance in midfield, yet Pirlo remained almost untouched by those demands. Not because he was exempt from work, but because his teammates understood that asking him to chase opponents would be a waste of the one quality nobody else possessed. If Pirlo controlled time, others had to control distance. At AC Milan, that balance was carefully constructed. Players like Gattuso absorbed duels, covered channels, and recovered loose balls. Seedorf provided physical presence and progression. Years later at Juventus, Vidal, Marchisio, and Pogba would perform similar functions. They pressed, they ran, they protected transitions. Pirlo, meanwhile, remained at the center of everything without appearing to dominate any individual battle. His influence wasn't built on winning possessions. It was built on deciding what happened immediately after possession was won. Teams weren't carrying Pirlo. They were investing resources into preserving the one player capable of organizing everyone else's movement. And the results justified that investment. Pirlo lifted the 2006 World Cup with Italy. He won 2 Champions League titles with Milan, collected multiple Serie A titles across 2 different eras, and became one of the few midfielders whose reputation extended beyond statistics or highlight reels. He was feared not because he could overwhelm opponents physically, but because opponents understood that allowing him time meant surrendering control of the match itself. Coaches instructed players to press him relentlessly, midfielders followed him into uncomfortable areas, and entire defensive structures shifted in anticipation of passes that had not yet been played. That is perhaps what football remembers most vividly about Andrea Pirlo. Not the trophies, impressive as they were, not even the Panenka against England. It remembers the feeling of inevitability that surrounded him, the sense that while everyone else was trying to make the game happen, Pirlo was simply waiting for it to arrive in the exact form he had already imagined. And in an era increasingly obsessed with speed, he quietly proved that understanding the rhythm of football can sometimes be more powerful than keeping up with it. Andrea Pirlo never changed football by inventing a new position. He changed it by altering what people believed a midfielder needed in order to control a match. For decades, influence in midfield had been associated with presence. Players imposed themselves through physicality, relentless movement, or the ability to dominate individual duels. As football evolved, those demands only intensified. Teams pressed higher, midfields became more compact, transitions became more frequent. The game appeared to be moving toward a future where standing still was becoming increasingly dangerous. Pirlo should have become obsolete. Instead, he became a reference point, because his career suggested something uncomfortable for modern football. Control does not always belong to the player doing the most work. Sometimes it belongs to the player doing the least unnecessary work. Pirlo understood that every sprint is often a correction for a previous mistake. Every desperate recovery run is evidence that someone else dictated the rhythm first. By positioning himself intelligently, delaying decisions, and releasing the ball at precisely the right moment, he removed problems before they demanded physical solutions. He wasn't avoiding movement. He was making movement more efficient for everyone around him, and that understanding left a lasting mark on the sport. Deep-lying playmakers were no longer viewed as luxuries from a disappearing era. They became tactical assets. Midfielders such as Xabi Alonso, Toni Kroos, Jorginho, and even aspects of Rodri's game inherited principles that Pirlo helped normalize. They don't replicate him completely, few players ever could, but they continue the same idea, that football can be controlled not only through space, but through time itself. So when people remember Andrea Pirlo, they often speak about elegance, the long passes, the free kicks, the effortless technique, but elegance was only the surface. What opponents truly feared was something much harder to defend. They feared a player who could slow a match down without stopping it, a player who could make 11 opponents move harder, think faster, and become increasingly impatient while he remained exactly where he wanted to be. Because football remembers those who run the furthest. But every now and then, it encounters someone who reminds us that the most powerful player on the pitch is not always the one chasing the game. Sometimes it is the one deciding when the game begins to move at all.